Right next to waiting side. All right.
What are you doing? She is still down, so
She's here now.
okay.
Smart ass. Yeah.
Northwest Agnostic next week,
Oh.
March. She's gonna start working,
North?
Oh.
Is that the one in 1960s? Oak Meadow Drive? Okay.
There's someone from the Department of Education sitting here. I want them to
They
know
have two places, they rent one, they
the
rent
crisis
one.
in education is about
Okay.
So she's
not paying faculty well and treating them poorly.
Well, you know, this is about the only country where the faculty don't get paid.
I don't know if it's the only country, but it sure is a real bad
Yeah, how long she
situation.
been in history?
We have 6-to-1 adjuncts in
She
our
worked for
department.
Harris County.
Okay,
And
so
adjuncts
where
are
should they
paid
residence?
terribly.
Yeah.
Lives
They
downtown, she
give
lives
no
just north
benefits.
of downtown, I-10.
We're taking these highly
45,
trained, educated
that
people
whole area where all
and
of a
we're
sudden
treating
all
them
these,
like dirt.
she's in one of those, you know, where exactly, you know, like.
I know exactly.
Problem.
45,
There's the
19.
problem.
I know exactly what you're
You're
talking
not
about.
getting paid.
And all of that, I mean.
I'm getting paid.
It's this
I can't complain.
little
I really can't. I'm not doing too badly. I can't complain. I could be doing a whole lot worse.
Considering other countries, you're not doing that well.
Maybe, I don't know, perhaps. I won't complain about my own salary. If I were an adjunct, I'd be.
Oh, yeah. And then all that gas going from one campus to the next.
Oh, yeah, the freeway fire. That's where we ought to be, you know, carrying pitchforks and holding torches, storming the gates. Well, with respect to that, yeah.
Hey, Timotheus. Covered on.
Your office is the first floor or the second floor? And the corner office, right in the beginning,
I
okay.
knew you guys, I'm very close to the other building.
Yeah.
And the last one.
She sees everything that's going on in that corner.
I know, I look out my window and I see the coming to goodness.
She takes notes.
You're the other one that did that.
It is. Sometimes it helps me know where to close the door if I see something.
Yeah.
Greetings.
Turn off the light.
Turn off the light, yes. Like, close the door, I'm not here. You bet it's true.
Because I've gone past it before.
And people, yeah, it works. I'm telling people this, this year that they should not pay me because people are
You gave her the last one on cosmology.
over here, I like to go to you, just don't let it just.
It was this semester or last
Yeah,
semester?
it's part of my mistake.
Hi, David. I've been, yeah, probably not was here.
Timotheus.
I don't remember any of it, but.
It was interesting.
It's turtles all the way down.
Sure, no problem. Whatever, however, it is. I think it was.
Hey, Ray. How are you? Yeah, come over.
He wants you to write.
Oh, write your name.
Oh, Ray.
Hey, Ray.
Yeah,
I forgot to mark on mine this week.
Can't be bothered to write.
Give me that right.
Done right.
You can't be there, right? I don't blame you, yes, I.
What, no multitasking?
No.
Oh, I didn't put my.
He's forging your signature.
Good. My wife does that all the time.
I've done it for my wife, so.
I just wrote his name there.
That's what you think, and you did not hear.
I just joking, since you're an English professor, I had to write an email to an English professor that I know at the school. She's a friend of mine for years. And so I'm very careful. It takes me like, 20, 30 minutes. I proofread it. It's been very short. About 2 minutes later, I get her reply back. It's big long.
That's all right.
All right, well, why don't we begin? Thank you all for coming this afternoon. And Shape Pilkington's CAC presentation, she has asked to defer till the fall, so she'll be speaking in the fall. So today, we have our colleague Mark Whitten from philosophy. Thank you, Mark, for putting this together. And Mark's title is, Does God Exist? The Fourth Option.
All right, well, it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. If you didn't pick up a copy, there's a handout up here. I think I've managed to eliminate most of the typos, but you work on it, and then there's that. I'd like to just briefly comment maybe on the first 2.5 pages. Wanted to make this presentation because of a couple of issues I've long thought. First of all, that rather there being 3 options with regards to the question of the existence of God, theism, atheism, and agnosticism, that there are actually 4. And I think that it is important to take note of what I consider to be the 4th option. Attendant to that, at least in my own mind, but I think in the minds of others, there has sometimes been some ambiguity and confusion over the term atheism and agnosticism. So I wanted to work a little bit on clarifying that in my own mind. I want to make a brief comment, as I do on the first page and the second page, about a couple of the assumptions this paper is working with. First of all, it is working from the assumption or assuming the so-called perfect being theology. Again, this is a very popular theology. It goes back to St. Anselm, who defined God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Typically, that is rendered that being greater than which nothing can be conceived. The idea of God as a personal creator of the universe, all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good. Now, I'm assuming that theology because that is sometimes called standard theism. Whatever the difference is between most Jews, most Christians, most Muslims, and whatever else they believe about God, traditionally, most of these 3 major Western traditions could say, we at least mean God as personal creator, all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good. It also happens to be the standard or the default theology of contemporary analytic philosophy. So if you start arguing for or against or about God in contemporary philosophy of religion, unless you otherwise state, you are assuming, and people are assuming, that you're talking about this perfect being theology. I am not necessarily saying that I subscribe to a perfect being theology, or that is the best way of understanding the reality of God. The second big assumption is called evidentialism with regards to belief. That in order to have a justified belief, one must have sufficient evidence for that belief. Sufficient evidence that would render a judgment of probability, the truth being, the belief being probably true or not. Again, there are lots of issues, lots of discussions in philosophy about those sort of things. And that's not the only way to argue for or against, but I am assuming this evidentialist perspective. I am also going to assume, for the sake here, because that I have actually established that there are 4 options. I approach this from the standpoint of your belief terminology. I think analysis of your belief terminology show there are 4 options. The belief content terminology, I think, appoints to 4 options. And if that didn't do it, simply the logical analysis of the agnostic or skeptical position using De Morgan's law and process as a simplification. I'm just going to take it, and certainly I'm open to challenge if you think I'm taking it wrongly, that there are in fact 4 options. So I presented those on the board. B/G, I believe God exists. That's theism. Belief /not G, I believe God does not exist. That is atheism, or perhaps we would want to call it strong atheism, because it makes a claim, it has a belief that God does not exist. Not the case that I believe that God exists. That is your traditional agnosticism. Thomas Henry Huxley coined a term in the 1800s to distinguish his position between those who claim to know or believe that God exists and those who claim to know or believe that God did not exist. Huxley said, well, I don't know one way or the other. I don't believe one way or the other. I fail to have a belief. So your traditional agnostic has at least said this: I do not believe that God exists. What has been overlooked, I think, in these discussions is that if you are a true skeptic, a true agnostic, you also do not believe that God does not exist. Now, I don't know, I've ever read a self-confessed agnostic who's gone on to make that second statement. They have very much emphasized the first: I do not believe that God exists. I do not recall seeing an agnostic or a skeptic go on and say, but I do not believe that God does not exist. The focus has been upon the third option. Now again, there are many atheists who would say, well, no, that's what atheism is. It's lacking a belief in God. Well, certainly you can choose to use the word that you wish to choose, explain what you mean by it. I'm not going to quibble over a word. This has been called sometimes weak atheism. Not that it's somehow intellectually weak, it's just not making a positive claim about the nature of reality. It is saying what you fail to believe about the nature of reality. And then I have selected a term that I think is appropriate: skeptical theism, to apply to the fourth option. So I'm going to assume, but certainly open to challenge, that the first 2.5 pages establish that there are, in fact, 4 options with regards to the question of God's existence. What I would like to do is briefly read through the last half of page 3, the first half of page 4, and then a couple of paragraphs from page 5, and then just throw it open to any questions or comments that you might have. Some of you have the opportunity to see this, but most of you have not. Some of you have copies in front of you. I guess most of you do, but if you don't, I'd like to read through it. And then I'll just stop and see what your responses and questions and comments may be. So page 3, the large print, the paragraph beginning with agnosticism. Agnosticism is not a very apt word. The issue is one of evidentially justified belief, not necessarily a claim to know in any strict sense of knowing. The agnostic is a skeptic. She does not believe that a particular belief, that God exists, can be justified or established as true by evidence. She holds that one must therefore suspend judgment. And I add there, belief judgment. Just because you suspend a belief judgment does not necessarily require one to suspend any or all types of judgment. One must suspend judgment regarding the existence of God. So traditional agnosticism is atheistic skepticism, and the agnostic is a skeptical atheist. This is due to the fact that the agnostic intellectually and practically engages the world without a belief that God exists, and lives in the world without a belief in God. However, the traditional agnostic professes not to have a belief, not to know either way. Not to believe that God exists, but also not to believe that God does not exist. Since it is a function of beliefs that they are action guiding, what is the basis for the agnostic to act or to live as if there is no God? I think it's because the agnostic accepts or takes as true the non-existence of God due to the absence of God from their personal intellectual experience and also, I think, practical experience. So going on to this fourth possibility, I do not believe that God does not exist. This option is also an instance of skepticism, in that one does not believe that a particular belief, I probably should have said not hold that a particular belief, in other words, God does not exist, does not believe that it can be justified or established as true by evidence. This person is agnostic in that he does not claim to believe or does not claim to know that God does not exist. He also does not claim to believe, does not claim to know that God does exist. He has suspended belief judgment on the issue. This does not necessarily mean, and I would hold should not mean, that he has suspended inquiry regarding the existence of God and cannot form some other type of judgment on the issue. Such a person may accept or take as true, just as the traditional agnostic or skeptical atheist does, in a different manner. May accept or take as true the existence of God in their personal living of life. This position constitutes theistic skepticism, and such a person would be a skeptical theist. Following, of course, is the fourfold analysis that I put on the board back here. All right, shifting to the back page, the double asterisk endnote. In addition to not believing that God does not exist, the skeptical theist also hopes that God does exist. Again, there is something odd about this skeptical theism. You're not believing in the denial of an existence claim. Well, you need to say what you are, not simply what you're not. So I think that, again, this is supplemented by a different propositional attitude, a different type of judgment. Not one of belief, but one of hope. The position of the skeptical theist is somewhat odd, in that intellectually he fails to believe a non-existence claim. What is it, positively, that the skeptical theist affirms about reality? The skeptical theist affirms God exists. But how? And why, if that affirmation is technically not one of belief? It is here that the propositional attitude and existential attitude of hope comes into play. The propositional attitude of the skeptical theist is not that of belief, in other words, to accept or take as true that which, based upon sufficient evidence, is probably true, but that of hope. To accept, take as true that which is based upon evidence, possibly true. The skeptical theist who acts on hope will accept or take as true that which the theist accepts or takes as true, namely, God exists. But the skeptical theist will live out that acceptance in hope despite insufficient evidence, with less epistemic confidence than does the theist who lives on the basis of belief with sufficient evidence. Yet the lives and actions of the theist and the skeptical theist may well be almost indistinguishable by the very nature of their shared acceptance, and also because religious faith is more than a matter of either belief or hope, but it's an acceptance or taking as true involving commitment, trust, and devotion. Skeptical theism may be understood as a type of fideism or faithism. But it's not the type of fideism that rejects reason, evidence, and argument, irrelevance of reason, fideism, but one which asserts that reason is relevant but, and the perhaps should be eliminated there, but limited with regard to the question of God's existence. John Bishop designates this fourth option to be supra-evidential fideism. According to Bishop, and this is a bad sentence right here, one should not and does not contradict the evidence in faith, but transcends limited evidence and ambiguity in a faith response to the issue of God's existence. Now, to close this out, I would remind you of the ending of the movie Shawshank Redemption. Andy Dufresne, of course, as you know, was imprisoned for the murder of his wife, which he did not commit. He spent years upon years upon years hollowing a tunnel through the prison wall through which he could effect his escape, which on one night he did. In writing to Red, his friend in prison, who has been released from prison and has gone to where Andy has left him a message, words very similar, I'm paraphrasing here, these are what Andy Dufresne says. Hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and hope never dies. I would submit to you that in his actions, Andy Dufresne may well not have believed he could escape the prison. He may not have judged that it was probable that he would be able to escape the prison. But he certainly judged it was possible that he could escape the prison. He acted on the basis of that possibility. He acted in hope, and in fact, he did escape the prison. Red, as he travels on the bus to hopefully meet up again with Andy Dufresne, talks about, I hope that I meet my friend again. I hope that the ocean is as blue as I imagine. Red may or may not have believed he would ever see Andy again. He may or may not have had sufficient evidence that would support a belief that he would ever see his friend again. I'm not sure that Red was acting on belief, but Red was acting on hope. And if you've seen the movie, spoiler alert, you haven't seen it, spoiler alert, but you should have seen it by now. They do meet at the end of the movie. Andy effected his escape, and he acted on hope. Red met up with his friend. He acted on hope. I would argue that probably neither one of those actions was based in belief, but based in hope, which I would say is actually the propositional attitude of faith. And with that, that is my account of skeptical theism. And I am now open to challenges, questions, comments, or complaints. Have at it.
Didn't Red go see him because he made a promise? I don't want to go too far off the topic.
Andy did ask Red to promise.
And so that's, you mentioned promise, so I think like promised land. So he just wanted to die believing in nothing, but he made a promise, miles to go before he slept, and so he went all the way down to Mexico.
You're reminding me of something that's in that movie also. Get busy living or get busy dying. So one of the things that I deal with in this paper and in communication with one of my colleagues is that I don't think the question of God's existence is a purely intellectual question. I don't think it's purely a matter of assessing whether evidence is sufficient or insufficient. Particularly what tips the scales between skepticism. Why would one person embrace, I do not believe that God exists, and their worldview basically does not include God? That is your agnostic, weak atheist, or skeptical atheism. Why would another person embrace, I do not believe that God does not exist, affirm the reality of God in hope, and God be a very important part of their worldview? What tips the scales? I think there are a number of factors that might do so. But part of that is simply we have to live life. And practically speaking, God, however you understand God, particularly God as traditionally conceived, either figures into your view of the world and the way you live your life, or pretty much doesn't figure into your worldview. It doesn't figure into your life. And I also want to say none of this implies any kind of disparagement upon either an atheist or a skeptical atheist. I tell my students, I am not an atheist today. Next week, I might have come to a different conclusion. So I have absolutely no desire and feel absolutely no need to cast any kind of character aspersions or negative judgments upon the atheist. I take atheism seriously, the atheist of whichever brand may be correct. So get ready, busy living, get busy dying. For some people, the choice is rooted in getting on with your life.
I think bringing up the point about promises is very interesting because God in the West is a promising God. And so how would you distinguish between belief in God and affirming what you call the reality? I think that's probably a term there, but affirming the significance, shall we say, of the promise of God. Because God without the promise, God without the covenants, is not the God of the West.
Well, I would make a distinction between what traditionally has been called natural theology and revealed theology. I would make a distinction between theology in general and philosophy of religion. Philosophy of religion does not assume any substantive beliefs of any particular religious tradition. Any belief or any thing that's accepted in the philosophy of religion, at least ideally, is accepted on the basis of canons of reason and evidence. So when you begin to talk about promises and covenants, you're talking about particular theologies, you're talking about a particular religion, you're certainly talking very much about, for instance, Judaism and Christianity, which have been at the center of Western culture.
I
So
quickly disagree and then give it to you, Jim. I would say no. We're talking about the logic of the speech act of the promise. We're talking about speech act theory here, and the covenant is one form of a promise. So we're not talking about a particular religious outlook. We're talking about the logic of promise, the logic and the rhetoric of promise.
I would simply say that's not a feature of contemporary analytic philosophy of religion, what you just stated.
It's a feature of contemporary theory of language.
They're two different areas. As I'm sure, but Ron, as I'm sure we both realize,
Yeah.
philosophy can be very critical of literary theory.
No, this is not
And literary theory can be very critical.
This is John Austin and John Searle. This is not.
Yeah, but John Austin is not some oracle that philosophers genuflect before.
Well, that's.
It's a particular perspective that can be argued for, that cannot be taken as a given.
I'm just going to say, it struck me the fact that this concept of deity seems to be a very small box. So yeah, you go back to Anselm, but he comes from a Christian tradition, so his concept of God is going to be molded by that. But really, if you think about it, there's probably innumerable types of gods, concepts of gods we could be dealing with. So why restrict it to just this little thing which we've been arguing off of? I know it.
No, it's an excellent point and an excellent question. I don't want to restrict it. I do make mention in here that many people assume that this theistic personalism, this idea of God as a personal God, all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, that intervenes in history from the outside and performs miracles and oftentimes has very anthropomorphic traits or whatever. Many people assume, I have assumed in the past, that that's classical Christian thought. But many Roman Catholic theologians, and particularly Eastern Orthodox theologians, say that's not classic Christian thought. That classic Christian thought is a little bit more in the direction of Aristotle's perspective and has much in common with Eastern views, particularly the view of, say, Brahman in Hinduism or Eastern religion. So these sorts of discussions all depend upon what you mean by the word God. And I think that it should not be so restricted. I've seen some theists who, in essence, at least part of the argument is, I'm a theist because the only alternative is to be an atheist. And there's no way I can be an atheist, so I have to be a Christian theist. And that's a false dilemma. There are other major traditions of humankind that give very different concepts of God. So this whole discussion is assuming this perfect being theology. If we were to start using a different theology, which we may well should in another context, the conclusions, the dynamics might be quite different. It's a very well taken point you just made.
I've been intrigued with the kind of the going by the evidence. So the perfect God really doesn't accord with the evidence. I mean, if you look at the world, how the world is made, and the concept of good among those three criteria is really suspect because it's really a human, maybe even a psychological term. So what is good? You know, we have to understand that it has certain attributes, but it really could be lots of things. You know, so again, that whole thing is kind of fuzzy. But really, if you opened it up and looked at other possible explanations for reality, or human beings, or whatever, I think that's to me, and there's a lot of discussion lately, in the last 50 years or so, as we come to know more and more about how the universe works, that there's some really interesting concepts of origins that may or may not involve a being that thinks like us, feels like us, understands what good and bad is like us, doesn't necessarily have to be.
But wouldn't those 4 points hold for that God?
I don't think so.
I think whatever the content is, whatever your God concept is, I think that all 4 of these would apply. You would either believe that that God exists, or you would believe that that God, under whatever description, does not exist, or you would fail to believe that God exists, or you would fail to believe that God does not exist. I think this fourfold logic applies to any concept of God.
But if you take apart the three constituents of that, good part, for example, that to me is the weakest thing. Why does it have to be good? Are we the apex of creation that we're good? There could be other forms of goodness that is beyond our understanding.
Absolutely. Again, but that would change the discussion. I don't mind changing this, not miss it here. That would change the issue at the point at issue. I don't mind putting the point at issue. I think, again, that's very worthwhile doing. Again, there's John Leslie is a philosopher who is more like Platonic in his view. He doesn't talk about a personal God, but he talks that goodness somehow creates the universe in kind of a Platonic sense. And this goodness that John Leslie talks about is not your super being, Superman theism of Christianity, but it's not simply matter and motion either. Nirguna Brahman of Hinduism, Advaita Vedanta, is ultimate reality beyond any particular attributes, including goodness, that we could subscribe. I think those perspectives are well worth exploring. I was talking to my philosophy of religion class today, and we were talking about teleological or design arguments. Well, all right, you've got this apparent order or design in the universe. So one possible explanation, you have a designer God. One possible explanation is that there's some necessity involved in the equations, that only one universe is possible, and this is it. One possibility is, though, a multiverse, that this is simply one universe among maybe an infinite number of universes, and so by chance some of them are going to have the features this one has. So whatever the ultimate reality is, it doesn't necessarily have to be a personal God. It doesn't necessarily have to be a good God. It doesn't necessarily have to be the God and Father of the Lord Jesus Christ or anything like that. It could be Brahman, it could be goodness, the ultimate reality could be the multiverse. I mean, this is ultimately an exercise in metaphysics. What's the nature of ultimate reality? So I don't think I'm disagreeing with much of what you said. I will disagree with the topic for another day about how the term's goodness, but that gets really thorny issues of language.
Why couldn't we replace God exists with light bends around the sun? I believe light bends around the sun. I believe light does not bend around the sun. Those are two affirmative beliefs.
And one has evidence the other one.
I do not believe light bends around the sun. That's not believing. It's not an affirmative belief. It's saying I don't believe this. And I do not believe light does not bend around the sun. Those are four different positions, and that's the point. I think that's the importance of what you're claiming here, is that you have these four different positions on a particular proposition. And
I would like to add, it is often said, and you've said it, there is no evidence for the existence of God. There are other people of equally sound mind and good character who would say there's abundant evidence for the existence of God. So there are issues of what constitutes evidence. There are issues of what constitutes sufficient evidence. And then one other point I would make is that ultimately the existence of God, in the sense that I would want to do it, it's a metaphysical claim. And so you might add, well, what's the evidence that materialism is true as an ultimate explanation of reality? Well, you'd have to be hard-pressed to say, well, that's a piece of evidence that proves materialism. That's proof of evidence because materialism is how you interpret everything. And so ultimately, God, as a metaphysical claim, is a worldview that interprets everything. And so the claim that there has to be this piece of evidence or that piece of evidence, again, is probably working with this idea of this super person, super thing God. And I don't blame an atheist for saying that, because most of the theism that atheists are going to hear about is this super being, super thing theism. They're just taking seriously what they hear being said and being claimed around them. So I would dispute that there is no evidence, and I would dispute even that it's quite as simple as that, well, whether there's this evidence or that evidence, if in fact the question of God is a metaphysical question. Tim, come at it. And I appreciate Tim's help on a couple of things in the paper. He helped me point out some of our problems.
My question is just on the notion of I believe. you mentioned that it's action guided, but I'm wondering where something like blind faith fits in this. Now, I know that's a type of belief, but it doesn't necessarily have the type of backdrop that I think we're looking for when I say I believe X, Y, or Z. So I'm just hoping you could maybe explain where you might see something like blind faith on either side fitting into a discussion like this.
Yeah, the problem is, again, there are problems with our language. You know, as you well know, a significant part of philosophy is trying to get clear about our language. In fact, Wittgenstein said the whole point of philosophy is to beware of being bewitched by our language, whatever. And there's ambiguity. There's ambiguity with regards to belief. A lot of people use belief colloquially to simply I affirm, or I accept, or I hold as true. What I'm taking belief technically is a propositional attitude towards that which you hold that, based upon the evidence, is probably true. So on that evidence, a person who has blind faith is really doing so apart from belief. I would argue they're doing it apart from hope. If it's truly blind, it's wishful thinking. And certainly people act based upon wishful thinking. People act mindlessly. I think they are failing in their ethical and intellectual responsibilities when they do so. And did I even address your point?
Almost. So my question is this. Belief is a propositional attitude. If they're in a sense failing, I'm almost thinking that somebody who holds a belief based on blind faith is probably, from my point of view, likely to fall under skeptical theism more than theism.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's out of line.
Yeah, I don't know, because I think a person who is just basically unreflective, it's hard to fit them into this category because they're unreflective. You know, I mean, I believed in God. I made some kind of profession of faith when I was 4 years old, but for a lot of causes or reasons or whatever. I think a completely unreflective person, well, they're not a theist and they're not a strong atheist. There's no question about that. But if you haven't even considered issues of evidence, I don't think you're even playing the belief game. You may use the language. You're just accepting. And I think once you become reflective, you're committed to taking one of these four positions. If you're not reflective, then people accept all kinds of stuff.
Couldn't a validation scheme be, my peers believe it predominantly, therefore it must be true?
I should hope not.
But that is a validation scheme that is commonly employed.
It's commonly employed, especially among academicians.
Well, it's the fallacy of appealing to the crowd.
Right, absolutely.
And you know, your basic introductory logic would say just because everybody believes something doesn't make it true. But I agree with you, Jim. I think one major factor in why many people hold the religious beliefs that they do, but I also agree with Mark. I think a major factor in why some people may not hold certain beliefs is because of the particular crowd they run in. So if you grow up as I did in the church crowd, you're going to pick up your beliefs kind of like by osmosis. And the fact that everybody believes it is going to seem to make it true. But you can be in some more select groups, and it doesn't necessarily have to be religious beliefs. It can be political beliefs or whatever. And I have found that sometimes academicians can be just as conformist as any religious believer can be, given the particular crowd they run with, the particular area of studies they participate in. I think it's a common human problem.
Mark.
Yes, I mean,
Do you think that the latter three propositions are evolution of the first? And if that's the case, will we have the fifth proposition over here, which is different from the first four ones? Do we have the fifth type of believing or not believing in God? Even though it might not fit that B, G, B not G, and not B, G, and not B, not G.
I'm not sure I'm following you. Help me
Well,
understand.
it would be IDK, right?
Well,
In the parlance of kids today, it would be I don't know.
Okay, let me just ask the first part. Do you think the latter three are the evolution of the first one? Means somebody faced a question, therefore came up with the second proposition, And then a group came up with a different type of questions, and they came up with a third type. And the different question led to the fourth type. That's the question that I'm asking. You hinted to that people, when they are raised among their colleagues and so forth, so on, goes back to the issue of faith. That since I was raised and bred among these colleagues and all these are Christian, therefore I have to be a Christian. So I don't know how else to ask my question.
Do you think it
Again, is there any other solution that might come out?
I think I may be understanding. First of all, for many, many people in our culture, given the influence of religion, they start from believing that God exists. And then, like I did. And then, but perhaps you are a fairly intelligent, thoughtful, reflective person. And you become aware that, first of all, there are people who don't believe that God exists. And at first you think these are bad people. And then you discover, well, maybe there are actually some good reasons why a person might believe that God does not exist. And then you perhaps become aware that the issues are even a bit more complicated than that. That, well, maybe it's not so much I believe God doesn't, they don't believe God doesn't exist, but fail to have a belief in God. And then at some point, at least, you recognize, but gee, there's a fourth option. You might not believe that God does not exist. So I think in the experience of a person, there could be this development. I would point out, though, I think some people just as well start out with, I believe God does not exist. If you're raised in an atheist house, again, I'm not necessarily going to assume that it's a conformist situation, but nevertheless, the influence of parents, the influence of a subculture can be very strong. Some people might start from the standpoint of, I believe that God does not exist. And again, if they're an intelligent, thoughtful, open person, sooner or later, they're going to come into contact with people who do believe that God exists. And sooner or later, it may take a while, you may actually come upon, I shouldn't say that, you'll come across some people who actually thoughtfully believe that God exists. And then hopefully, sooner or later, you come to the point where maybe things are not quite so simple that it's either you believe that God exists because there's sufficient evidence, or you believe that God exists because there's not sufficient evidence, but the situation is more ambiguous. However, I think that these four are both necessary and sufficient account of the options. I don't see the possibility of a fifth proposition attitude. I don't see it. Maybe I'm missing something.
In logic.
Okay, in logic.
If you constrain yourself to logic.
Yeah, I think I'll
This is a
do
logical proposition.
I think I'll do that. At least for our purposes today, I think I'll do that. No, there are different logics. I'm not meaning to be cute there. But I will simply have to, so I'll make another one of my assumptions within the constraints of logic.
Mark, you were talking about people intellectually reflecting. What about more on a gut level, that many people may start off with the belief that God exists, but then something happens, something bad happens, they're dealing with the problem of evil. I'm thinking, is there things that distinguish them down the line? So, if my children die, I believe God does not exist. If I see evil happen to other people, do I go with maybe agnosticism that I don't know, or I don't believe that God exists from what I see? Do you think there's more of a gut level on people's reaction about whether they think God exists or not, and if he does, what type of God he is?
Yes, I do. And I think that there are many people who believe in God for primarily emotional reasons. I also think there are some people who used to believe in God, but no longer believe in God, sometimes for primarily emotional reasons. I think there are people who don't believe in God that come to believe in God, sometimes for primarily emotional reasons. I think it works all ways because we're all human beings. We're all in the same human condition, and stuff happens. I'd like, if I could, that's very relevant to what you just said, read an excerpt from an email that I sent in response to a colleague. And let's see, where is this? I'll get to it in a second. Oh, I do not think that people come to these issues as blank slates or with complete indifference as to the outcome of their investigations or their reasoning, if they engage in investigations or reasoning at all. Non-rational factors play a role. Religious experience, lack of religious experience, loss of religious experience can play a role. Encountering great suffering and evil can play a role, either your own or that of other people. Many people are atheists because they are very sensitive to the suffering in the world and find it incompatible with the idea of the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God. The argument from evil is intellectually and psychologically the most powerful atheist argument. So I think there are a number of reasons. At some point, some people have just simply said God just became less and less real to me. And at some point I realized I no longer believed in God. On the other hand, there have been some people have said God just became more and more real to me. And I realized I believed in God. So I don't want to present this issue as, first of all, as James has pointed out, there's a broader issue rather than just belief in one particular God understood in terms of one particular theology. But it's not just a matter of intellect or reasoning or evidence. It's a matter of the life lived, existential questions. And I think the existential questions oftentimes are very strong in establishing someone in a particular position or changing a particular position. So I think your comment, very insightful. Yes, sir. Tony.
Well, going back to partly what Tim was mentioning about blind faith, it seems like another overlay that could be used in part to explicate this would be to think about the distinctions of sort of intellectual or academic view of God in these categories, and also the impact of social influence or religion versus spirituality. And that is a very interesting question when we talk about blind faith, because are you going to obtain blind faith when you are pursuing, you as an individual are simply pursuing this notion of God out there? Or is it a shared social experience in which you might be sort of nudged or educated, to use your point, educated to move forth in this blind faith? Well, you may not be able to see this, but just accept on blind faith that this is true. And it's kind of interesting to think about the distinction between sort of an individual perspective on this and what we acquire from a social perspective.
I think even the notion of blind faith involves a certain level of reflection on someone. You wouldn't call it blind if you weren't contrasting it with a faith that's not blind and contrasting it in a negative way. So if someone else says that Joe has blind faith, again, Joe may be simply a blind faither, but you're at least recognizing there's something blind there. He doesn't deal with evidence. He doesn't believe based upon evidence. I think that, again, the moment that a person would characterize themselves as having blind faith, they've at least put a foot inside the door of becoming reflective. And a blind faither would be your fideist, your reason is irrelevant, if not the enemy type of fideist. And so when I present faith options for my students, one option is I accept faith and I reject reason. Because reason is at best irrelevant, and is at least at worst the enemy of faith. So the early church father Tertullian is credited with saying, I believe because it is absurd. He asked the question, what does Jerusalem faith have to do with Athens reason? Absolutely nothing. Now again, you'd want to take his comments in context, but they have often been used as an expression of this kind of blind faithing. But it's a position known as fideism, in terms of reason is the enemy. Reason is at best irrelevant, and reason at worst is the work of the devil. And certainly there are people who embrace that kind of blind faith. I have students that embrace that kind of faith. When it comes again to simply socially accepting, again, I think we accept many things in terms of social cultural influence that we never really reflect upon. We just kind of, that's the way things are. And we don't contradict them. We go along. We practically accept them. We practically live them out. I give to my students the example that I had a pretty good family. They weren't virulently racist, but they had some pretty definite ideas about race. And one of those ideas that somehow I picked up, very clearly picked up somehow, is that God created white people to date and marry white people. And God created black people to date and marry black people. And God created brown people to date and marry brown people. And if there had been purple people, my parents would have believed God created purple people to date and marry purple people. And so I remember the first time I saw an interracial couple. It was in the parking lot of the Gulf Mart grocery store at the corner of Burnett Road and Steck Lane in Austin, Texas. It was a black-white couple. I don't remember which was what. And they stopped and they had a kiss in the parking lot. And I must have been 6 or 7. And I thought to myself, ooh, yuck. Now, if you'd asked me if I was some kind of believer or something, I don't know that I was some kind of believer. I never thought of it in terms of belief. I had just picked up, shall we say, the attitude that that was wrong. Now, I go hasten to tell my students when I mention this, so let me hasten to say now, I don't believe that anymore because I've reflected upon racist beliefs. I've asked what reasons or evidence there might have to make any kind of distinction whatsoever between the relationship of two members of species Homo sapiens, one who happens to have a little darker skin and one who happens to have, I see no good reason or evidence whatsoever to support that kind of attitude or way of living or belief. But when I was 7 years old, I don't know that it was really a matter of belief. I think it was a matter of, again, kind of social indoctrination and culturation, that sort of thing. So, I think, Tim, Tony, I think there are a lot of ways people live their lives. They're not reflected believers. In some sense of the word, they're not really believers. They have attitudes. They have life stances. They have ways of acting.
There you go. In a real sense, you just said they're not believers. And so they've taken on a social application so they can feel something.
So maybe that comes back to Habib here. Maybe if you step outside what I think is a very important, shall I say, game to play here, but let's call it a game to play. Let's call it the academic game. Let's call it the philosophical game. Let's call it the logical game. If you're playing that game, I think these are the 4 positions you could take. These are the 4 pieces that are on the board. But if you're not playing the game, if you're not really believing, if you're not really concerned about evidence, if you're just kind of living out what feels good or what seems to be correct or whatever, I guess maybe that's kind of a 5th option. But it's an option because it's an option not to play the game. It's an option not to be reflective, I think. Jeff?
I see a connection between positions 1 and 3 and also another connection between positions 2 and 4. I believe that position 1 is the response to a validation scheme. You have a validation scheme that when applied to the hypothesis or proposition that God exists results in a high level of confidence that the proposition is true. Whereas position 3 is I have a validation scheme that when applied to the proposition that God exists produces a low level of confidence that the proposition is true. So in this case, we're talking about validation only there.
Okay.
Validation scheme applies to 1 and 3. Falsification applies to 2 and 4. For position 2, that's to say that I have a falsification scheme that when applied to the proposition that God exists yields a high level of confidence that the proposition is false. Whereas position 4 would be I have a falsification scheme that when applied to the proposition that God exists produces only a low level of confidence that the proposition is false. And so I see this as an application of 2 different positions, validation schemes for positions 1 and 3, and falsification schemes for positions 2 and 4. It's possible for someone to reject all validation schemes, and there could, or perhaps have many validation schemes, or vice versa with falsification schemes, to only accept falsification schemes. or to have perhaps many falsification schemes. It's even possible for someone to have a validation scheme that, when applied to the proposition that God exists, yields a high level of confidence that the proposition is true, and yet also have a falsification scheme that, when applied to the proposition, also yields a high level of confidence that the proposition that God exists is false. So you can have...
Yeah, he actually sent this to me in email. I promise you it does make sense.
Yeah. So it's possible to have both a validation scheme that says the proposition is true with a high level of confidence, and a falsification scheme that says the proposition is false with a high level of confidence.
And what Jeff has presented here is, again, the possibility of a fifth possibility, because I've said sufficient evidence, God exists. Sufficient evidence, God does not exist. Insufficient evidence, God exists or does not exist. But Jeff is raising the issue that if you have one scheme, validation scheme, and one falsification scheme, and these would be procedures or processes, in a sense, another kind of game you're playing, it's possible that you could end up with sufficient evidence that God exists, but also sufficient evidence that God does not exist. Okay? Which is not on the board here. Okay?
But I'm using fuzzy logic here, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you're using fuzzy logic or not. And I'm not going to challenge you too far on logic, Jeff. Certainly not on mathematics. I do have some questions here, but it would be a kind of odd skepticism or an odd agnosticism. In this case, I have sufficient evidence that God exists. I have sufficient evidence that God does not exist. Now, either one of these is believable because I have sufficient evidence, right? But I can't believe both because they're mutually contradictory statements. So again, I still think you're in a position of that even the skeptic is, you're going to have to live a choice. You're either going to live taking as true, taking as verified that God exists, or you're going to live taking as true, taking as verified or falsified the existence of God. God does not exist. And I think ultimately we're in the realm here of what's called practical reason. So a very significant influence on my thought is that of William James. I commend him to you. You know him as the father of American psychology. You should also know him as one of America's foremost philosophers, the late 19th, early 20th century. Classic essay. If you've never read it, you need to read it. The Will to Believe. And James addresses situations where you have ambiguity. So you can have ambiguity, not sufficient evidence either way, or Jeff is raising the possibility, which I cannot at this point reject. You could have ambiguity in the sense of sufficient evidence both the ways. Either way, you're in a position of ambiguity. And James argues in The Will to Believe that in a situation of ambiguity, a person can be justified in making a choice. What he called willed believing, based upon what he called your passional nature. That your passional nature in a situation like that rightly and even necessarily will tip the scales one way or the other. Now, this does not, again, justify belief in Santa Claus or the Great Pumpkin. But he said it has to be a situation of evidential ambiguity, which would be in Jeff's situation, and that there's sufficient evidence on both sides. Or the skeptical situation, there's insufficient evidence. It has to be a situation of ambiguity. The option has to be a live option. You find it believable. Whatever the reason causes, you find it believable. It has to be important, a momentous option. So you don't do this reasoning on trivial questions. And it has to be forced, which means the necessities of action require you live out one perspective on the other. And James argues specifically with relationship to the question of God in a situation of evidential ambiguity, where reason, he said, cannot decide one way. James said if reason can decide, you go with reason. But if in your best judgment reason can't decide, then you're within your right. He said he probably should have entitled the right to believe. And I would say he should have entitled the right to hope. But be that as it may, the will to believe based upon your passional nature. That you're fully justified and allowing your passional nature to tip the scales one way or the other. So I think in either situation, whether it be the skepticism here or the kind of ambiguity that Jeff's fifth option may present, I think ultimately it's a matter of practical reason. And you're going to live a choice. And again, you probably don't come to it as a blank slate. If you ever find yourself as a reflective person in that situation, you're probably not completely indifferent as to which of the two options you would prefer. For whatever reasons, you may be disposed toward affirming God exists. For whatever reasons or causes, you may be disposed toward God does not exist. And whichever one you live out, it's ultimately a matter of practical reason. I would say it's a part of your compassionate nature. And I think that's just an unavoidable dimension of being human. Of reason, the exercise of reason, having practical limits, and I'm prepared to say even reason itself being reasonably held to have theoretical limits.
I think another angle on this is that God is an aesthetic in a sense.
Okay.
And poet Wallace Stevens writes about the idea of a necessary fiction. And this, I think, fits in with what you're talking about, the practical and with hope. We need hope. We don't need belief. We need the illusion, perhaps, that hope is going to produce something better. But that necessity, that is an illusion, but it's necessary. And it has a certain aesthetic component because it often is presented in a work of art, let's say, or it's presented in an articulation of some kind, which is rhetorical. And I would go back to the point I made at the very beginning. This seems to me ultimately to go back to the rhetoric and the logic of promising. And there's a 3-volume book by Ernst Bloch, who you may know, called The Principle of Hope, Das Prinzip Hoffnung, and he essentially makes your argumentation across 3 volumes. And the essence is hope for him. And of course, he's a member of the Frankfurt School, and he's neo-Marxist, and so he politicizes. Right? You don't, but you could. But he also aestheticizes it. I think that's where this ultimately goes.
Yeah, I think you've raised a couple. First of all, I think the issue of aesthetics or beauty is very important. And some would make stronger claims based on aesthetics or beauty. That rather than aesthetics or beauty or the necessities of our experience of beauty, aesthetics, rather than presenting necessary fictions, it might be a basis upon affirming that something beautiful, ultimately beautiful, actually exists. Because God has oftentimes referred to as the good, the true, and the beautiful. This is a book that I would commend to you by David Bentley Hart. The Experience of God, Being, Consciousness, and Bliss. And some of you may recognize the subtitle is the so-called Hindu characterization of ultimate reality, Sat Chit Ananda. Brahman is beauty, is being, consciousness, but aesthetics is the bliss part of Brahman. And so not only is the nature of Brahman beauty, but that our experience of beauty actually points us to a reality. On the other hand, it may point us to a useful
This is
fiction.
one way of understanding the aesthetic. Another is structure. And they're not the same. All right. You want to pass those around?
Yes, I will. So can I make a brief comment? All right. I would argue that if you are an atheist, you ought to read this book. If there's one book I'd tell you ought to read, it's this book. Okay? That doesn't mean you have to go out and buy it, read it, but I'm just saying that's why I think. So I'll start that. If you are a theist, and there's one book I think you need to read, it's by my favorite atheist philosopher of religion, J.L. Schellenberg, who has developed many say a sort of new atheist argument, the argument from divine hiddenness. Now, I can't go into but the basic idea is that because so many people find God to be hidden or silent, and many of those people would desperately like to see God, or hear God, or know God, that given this standard perfect being theology, the hiddenness of God is a very powerful argument for the non-existence of God. Now again, you'd have to read the book, but And if you combine divine hiddenness with the problem of evil, you have one heck of a powerful, double-barreled atheist argument. A lot of people can stand a whole lot of suffering as long as they feel God is with them. But if you combine a whole lot of suffering and a complete absence of any God experience, well, anyway, very powerful intellectually and existentially. And then this idea of supra-evidential fideism, this idea of willed believing, James has to be developed. James has to be updated. John Bishop is a professor of philosophy at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And his book here is Believing by Faith, an essay in epistemology and ethics of religious belief. That one's by Oxford. This one, too, is by Oxford. No, is that Cornell?
That's Cornell.
Cornell. This is Oxford. So if I in addition to William James Will to Believe, I would recommend John Bishop to you. And then if you're just looking for a very competent proponent of your perfect being theist who thinks that there is sufficient evidence to affirm not only the reality of God, but will actually use Bayes' theorem to establish that Jesus rose from the dead, Richard Swinburne, former professor, knowledge professor of the philosophy of religion at the University of Oxford. Richard Swinburne is a major figure in contemporary philosophy of religion. I am not endorsing his view, his approach, his conclusions, but Richard Swinburne is a force to be reckoned with. So there's a lot of good stuff out there. These are four that I would especially recommend.
Anybody else have a comment or question? Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I just want to. Again, I think there is the ambiguity to the question of what a so self-proclaimed atheist is committed to. Some atheists commit themselves to holding that God does not exist. They believe there is sufficient evidence for the claim, the belief about reality. God does not exist. Whether you're a theist or an atheist, the strong atheist, it's always appropriate to ask someone making a claim why. And in philosophy, the appropriate response would be to present as best you can whatever reasons, whatever evidence. You may not be able to present a formal argument that would answer that very legitimate question, why. But there are atheists who say, well, atheism is simply lacking belief in God. The problem I have with that, I'm not going to say you can't call yourself an atheist and say I lack belief in God. But the problem I have with that is that it confuses that kind of atheism with agnosticism. This is exactly what the agnostic says. And secondly, if you're an atheist lacking a belief in God, but someone else is an atheist who believes that God does not exist, how do you distinguish between their belief and your non-belief if you're using the same word? That's why some have characterized agnosticism as weak atheism as compared to a strong atheism. So I think that kind of ambiguity there. We've seen ambiguities in other parts of our language about belief. We have ambiguity in using the word God, which we have very much addressed here as well. I guess that's all I want to say. That's all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, next week, Dr. Fuller across will present the iconic films of the 1960s.
Should be fun. Surf's up.
Mark, if you can stay on some more questions.
Sure.
And then we have refreshments, so help yourself.
I'm not there. Not today. I am. It doesn't mean I don't want to.
I feel like I just had a workout.
Well, good.
That was good.
I've had one, I'll tell you that.